All right, buckle your seatbelts. We've made it to the only event in American history that really matters. World War II! I'm just kidding. But it's amazing how many people come up to me at parties and tell me they're a history buff, only to find out that they've just read 30 books on D-Day. Now, I'm not knocking D-Day. Big fan. And I'm not knocking people who are into World War II, i.e. dads and uncles everywhere. But hopefully by now you've seen that there are so many important moments that define the United States. So am I going to get into troop movements at Guadalcanal? No, just watch the Pacific on HBO. It's amazing. As always, what I'm going to focus on over the next few episodes are the big picture questions. Why did we get involved in World War II? How did we get involved? And how did it change our country? All right, so Hitler effectively came to power in 1933. He became extra aggressive in 1936, and the war in Europe started in 1939. If you want more detail than that, go check out episode 12 from season 1 of my podcast, which is all about the war from a world history perspective. Also very relevant to our conversation today is the rise of Japan. In the late 19th century, Japan had reinvented itself as a nationalist/capitalist state, looking to become the major power in the Pacific. But hey, we were becoming a nationalist capitalist state looking to become the major power in the Pacific. Like, we took the Philippines fair and square. But again, things start ramping up when Japan became extra aggressive in the 1930s, especially with the 1937 invasion of China. Again, for more detail, go check out my season 1 podcast episode on the war. What I want to focus on today is why did we enter World War II? Or kind of more accurately, why didn't we enter the war earlier? I mean, since George advised us against entangling alliances in Europe, we had been a mostly isolationist country up to this point. To be clear, I mean, we got way involved in the Western Hemisphere. Thanks, Monroe Doctrine, but we tried to stay out of European fighting as much as we could. And just a few years earlier, we'd gotten dragged into a European World War, and it was not fun, thank you very much. Like, what did we get for our trouble? A global depression, disenchanted young people, and race riots? I mean, sure, we also got flappers, but I'd say it was a net negative. Our isolationism was only strengthened by the Depression. I mean, we need to focus on ourselves for a while, show a little self-care before we can go out and fix other places, right? This attitude makes sense, but it's also going to lead to some unfortunate decisions. You know, like denying entry to Jewish refugees trying to flee Nazi Germany. The most extreme of the isolationists was an organization called the America First Committee. Future presidents JFK and Gerald Ford were young members, by the way. It was founded by a law school student who was also the son of the Quaker Oats guy. Not like the guy on the box, but his dad was one of the co-founders. Anyway, the leading voices of the America First Committee, most notably pilot Charles Lindbergh, often use similar white supremacist ideology to argue for staying out of the conflict in Europe. In his speeches, arguing that the US should stay out of European affairs as Nazi Germany was rising, he often made reference to white supremacist ideologies that sounded pretty similar to the kind of stuff Hitler was saying. In fact, when one or two members straight up reached out to the head of the Gestapo to ask how they could help Nazi Germany, like female pilot Laura Ingalls, who volunteered to become a spy, the Nazis responded by telling them to just keep doing their work on the America First Committee because that was helping more than anything else they could do. Oof. But the reason why the US stayed out of the war wasn't mostly because of handsome anti-Semitic pilots or Nazi spies, although all of that would make a great movie. We don't have enough movies about World War II. I've always said that. There were other reasons we didn't want to get into the war as well. For one, a senator named Gerald Nye had earlier published a report finding that American arms factories had made a ton of money off World War I. Now, this might not be a big surprise to us today, but it was to a lot of Americans who all of a sudden wondered for the first time, like, wait, did we send our men to go fight in a muddy trench because rich dudes back at home wanted to make more money? For many different reasons, Congress began passing neutrality acts throughout the 1930s that would make it illegal to support countries at war. At first, in 1935, we couldn't sell arms to any country at war, including our allies. But as the threat of Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire grew, we built in a few loopholes. Like in 1937, we established that if a nation at war wanted to buy non-military supplies from us, it had to be on a cash and carry basis. Like, you have to send your own ships to pick it up and pay us in cash. It's kind of like when you list a couch on Craigslist and the buyer asks you to deliver it to their house. No. The entire reason I listed it on Craigslist is so that I don't have to figure out how to get it out of my house. Bring your friends. And the reason we insisted on cash was because, well, our banks weren't super trusting of loaning foreign countries a bunch of money in 1937 in the midst of an economic depression. Seems reasonable. But by 1937, public sentiment was slowly putting its toes in the water of intervening at some point in Europe. I mean, for one, fascist dictator Francisco Franco won the Spanish Civil War, and people were like, oh shoot, I think fascism is bad? It also should be noted that even though most of the country and Congress was still isolationist, our president, FDR, was all for intervening. He basically believed that we were going to get dragged into a war at some point anyway, with the rise of Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire, so we might as well get out in front of it. And FDR did what he could to get out in front of it, potentially in violation of the Neutrality Acts. Remember last episode when I proposed that FDR was a super nice, non-dictator, possibly totalitarian leader? Well, he continued selling weapons to China as they were fighting the Japanese invasion. To be clear, he was supporting the nationalist government that was also fighting Mao's communists in China at the same time. So it was kind of a kill two birds with one stone kind of move. And he even secretly authorized US pilots to formally resign from the US military so they could create an independent First American Volunteer Group to go help the Chinese military. They became known as the Flying Tigers, and their job was to bomb Japan and defend China. Now, kind of ironically, some delays meant that they didn't actually see any action until after Pearl Harbor and our declaration of war. People were probably just really impressed, like, whoa, how did they get over there so fast? And FDR is just shrugging, pretending that he's just a really efficient commander-in-chief. Okay, so back to 1939. War begins in Europe, and FDR finds a loophole. Britain was asking the US for warships. And FDR was like, well, I'm not technically allowed to sell you warships, but we could trade them for use of British bases in the Atlantic Ocean, you know, like let you use our ships while they're stationed at your bases. Tricky FDR. This is known as the Destroyers for Bases deal. And the big deal here is that the public was mostly supportive. It shows that we were starting to come around to the idea that we should maybe at some point help our allies fight Hitler. We get even less neutral in 1940 after we see pictures of Hitler in front of the Eiffel Tower. Oh, shoot. Congress at that point passed the Lend-Lease Act that allowed the US to loan or lease out military supplies to the Allies, with the understanding that they will either return them or pay us back after the war is over. Just call 1-800-RENT-A-TANK now and claim your super special installment plan. And after the Nazi conquest of France, we also start allowing the US Navy to protect its ships carrying supplies to England and France in the convoy system. And all of these moves are just inching us closer and closer to outright war. As usual, FDR was kind of 10 steps ahead of the country. He and Winston Churchill had been talking and becoming war BFFs, even before the US was at war. In August of 1941, they signed the Atlantic Charter, which established that both nations were committed to building a post-war world of democracy, non-aggression, free trade, and freedom of the seas. Oh hey, some of Wilson's 14 points finally made it somewhere. Apparently, at this meeting, FDR also implied that he was looking for some incident that could justify him full out joining the war. Now, with American ships crossing the Atlantic, we had already had a standoff with a German submarine where they claimed that US ships sent bombs at the subs to provoke an attack. Now, it seemed that the German U-boats did ultimately fire first, but it's also clear that US ships were starting to be more aggressive than a peaceful convoy ship would normally be in the Atlantic, seeking out German submarines instead of just protecting unarmed American ships. So even though German U-boats were firing upon and sometimes sinking US ships in the Atlantic, FDR waited. He knew he needed a clear-cut event that would bring public support completely behind him in the war effort. Be careful what you wish for, Franklin. You see, while the public was watching Nazi Germany parade around continental Europe and invade Soviet Russia, Japan was also expanding throughout the Pacific. Wait, how did Japan get involved in all this again? The Japanese Empire had taken control of more and more land in the region, escalating things with its invasion of Manchuria and creation of kind of a puppet state in 1932. In response, throughout the 1930s, the US tightened economic restrictions on the island nation. We refused to sell them strategic materials like iron, airplane fuel, etc., because we knew they would likely use these materials to conquer more land from our allies. China, British India, French Indochina, and even some of our colonies like the Philippines. Ironically, though, our embargo only increased their need to expand to find new sources of those materials, but oh well. As the war between Japan and China developed, and it became clear that the US was backing the nationalist Chinese government, Japan signed an alliance with Germany and Italy in response. In July of 1941, Japan made a big move and invaded southern Indochina, taking control of British and French colonies in Southeast Asia. In response, FDR froze all Japanese assets in the US, reduced oil shipments, and sent General Douglas MacArthur, remember the bonus army guy who sent in tanks to clear a camp of homeless war veterans, to the Philippines to start building up American defenses there. At this point, it was clear to those in power, kind of on either side, that war was most likely inevitable. The question was really who was going to make the first move. As the two nations were negotiating in DC, US intelligence was decoding messages that Japan was preparing for war. Now, to be clear, that wasn't much of a surprise to the US military. In late November, the naval base at Pearl Harbor received a general war warning, but there was no specific mention of Hawaii as a potential target. Basically, the military was like, hey, we're probably going to have to fight Japan at some point, just a heads up, but we're not sure when this is going to start. And the leadership at Pearl Harbor figured that the obvious first targets were places way closer to Japan, the Philippines, Guam, all those islands that we gained during the Spanish-American War. And they weren't entirely wrong, because on December 7th, 1941, Japan did attack the Philippines and Guam, but they also attacked Pearl Harbor, which was direct American soil. As a result of the surprise attacks, 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 4 other vessels were sunk or seriously damaged. Over 180 aircraft were destroyed, and most importantly, 2,403 Americans were killed, with over 1,000 more injured. This would be the worst attack on the US in its history until September 11th. And now I want to clarify what I mean when I say surprise attack. Because it is true that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise. There's always conspiracy theories going around that the US government knew and let it happen anyway to justify going to war. But that conspiracy theory was first circulated by a guy named John Flynn, who was a co-founder of, drumroll, the America First Committee. So he was just trying to keep us out of the war. Most historians reject the idea that the US had actual specific knowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack beforehand. So the attack itself was a surprise, and it was a huge shock to the American people who had mostly been focusing on Hitler. I mean, think about it. The US had really never been attacked on its own soil. I mean, at least not since the War of 1812. But historically, the attack wasn't quite as surprising. I say this because many Americans are presented with this idea that the US was just hanging out in Hawaii, minding its own business when Japan attacked us out of the blue. And that's not true. Tension between the US and Japan had been brewing really ever since Matthew Perry showed up in Tokyo with gunboats in the 1850s. The question was not whether or not we would go to war with Japan, but really when. And on December 7th, 1941, FDR got his clear justification for war. The next day, he asked Congress to declare war on Japan, and Congress voted 470 to 1 in favor of war. Wait, who was the one person who voted against going to war? Jeannette Rankin. I know her. She's the first woman elected to Congress. Remember, she was the one who voted against World War I too because she was a pacifist? I mean, I gotta respect a woman who sticks to her values. Germany and Italy honored their alliance with Japan and declared war on the US, but they hoped that this would be mostly symbolic, thinking that the US would now have to spend most of its time fighting in the Pacific, which would allow Hitler and Mussolini free rein in Europe. They were wrong. Germany and Italy also figured that they were going to need Japan's help fighting Russia at some point, but what they didn't account for was just how motivational World War II would prove to be for the United States military. Because we weren't just going to fight Japan in Asia. We were effectively going to build up enough strength to fight and supply 2 militaries, one in Europe and one in the Pacific. It's pretty badass. Cue patriotic American music. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.